Becoming a man ideally happens in the context of community.
Yeah.
In many ways, becoming a sage, that second passage, is something that you have to do alone. It is not something that passage is, no one else is going to be able to do that work for you.
Well, welcome to the True Man Podcast. I have to tell you, now, when this topic of being a sage landed on my desk from today's guest, I jumped all over it. And I'm going to let my guest, Chris Bruno, define what that is here in a minute. However, I will say this. I think the idea of being a sage and having a sage are extremely important for both men involved. I know I've gone out of my way to make sure I have sage men in my life because their knowledge, wisdom, and thoughtfulness just provide extremely wise counsel. So let's talk more about that. Welcome to the True Man Podcast, Chris Bruno. Chris is the co-founder and CEO of Restoration Project and the CEO of ReStory Counseling. He is the author of Sage, A Man's Guide into His Second Passage. Chris, welcome to the True Man Podcast.
Mike, it's so great to be here with you. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Yeah, Chris, it's a pleasure to have you on and talk about being a sage. For a man who's listening right now who may not have heard of this term, define what the word sage means. Let's start with that.
That's such a great place to start because whenever you start to think about sage, a lot of people don't even know what the word means, or they associate it with like an herb.
Right.
So we have to actually come to an understanding of what we're talking about. So the way that I like to talk about that, Mike, is first that everybody kind of knows what a hero is. And we think about all the stories that we love, the movies that we love, and all of that. But behind every hero is another hero. And that hero behind the hero is what I would call the sage. And that is that older, wiser, kind of more, it's the Gandalf, it's the Yoda, and biblically there's sages all over the place as well. There's a Nathan behind the David, there's a Paul behind the Timothy. There's sages that kind of stand somewhat in the background, but really create the context for the hero to become the hero that he is. Yeah. So if we think about what is a sage, it is someone who is potentially a little bit older, not necessarily, but potentially a little bit older. And we get that word elder from, right? There's someone who is an elder in the community, in the church, in the family. But there's a big difference, Mike, between someone who is an elder and someone who is elderly.
That's true. Yeah.
So I want to hold the balance of, it's not just someone who is old that automatically becomes a sage. It is someone who has the kind of characterological development inside of their soul that moves them into becoming that sage. It's not every old person who automatically becomes a sage. So that's kind of where I would start, that hero behind the hero.
It's interesting that you say that. I'm going to say that I heard somebody close to me once say, who's a little older, I'll leave it at that, said, well, what do I have to offer at this stage? And I got to say, my heart skipped a beat when I heard it from this person because, holy cow, you have a tremendous amount to offer. And I really felt like that they were missing the boat from the standpoint of they had an opportunity to be a sage, but they didn't know it.
Right.
And my heart kind of skipped a beat because this particular person's been a sage for me for probably 20 some odd years. Now maybe they don't know it. Maybe I should explain that to them. I don't know. But have you seen this?
Oh my gosh. Yes. And that is something that, Mike, I really feel passionate about, is that I would love to catalyze a generation of sages amongst my generation and those coming up underneath me, after me. Because I feel like what we have in the world is kind of this dearth of people who have that kind of attitude that you just talked about. Like, what do I have to offer anymore? Technology I don't even know how to log into my computer. I don't know what TikTok is. I don't know. So therefore, I don't have anything to offer. And I think that is such a false idea, because being a sage doesn't have to do anything with information. Being a sage has to do with presence.
Oh,
It
yeah.
has to do with, it's not what you know, it's what you bring as far as your being, your sense of presence and solidness and settledness and all of that to the world. And we don't have those kinds of people anymore. I say this often, that, people who think about being a sage is I have to offer advice to the next generation below me. And there might be some aspect of that, like some level of advice, but what we've done is we've taken the need for advice away from the older generation and turned it into YouTube. So
so true.
It's so true. Like every time I need something with my car, I do not ask my dad. I ask YouTube, help me with what to do here. What kind of mortgage should I get? What kind of, property should I buy? How do I fix this on my vehicle? Those are the kinds of things that advice has got. There's experts in all kinds of areas that we don't need sages for anymore, but those experts are not actually providing us the kind of presence and solidness and wisdom that doesn't have to do with information. Like I said, it has to do far more with the wisdom of experience, of knowing beyond knowing, just from a life of reflection and, as I said, settledness. And my term is kind of coming home to yourself in a way that that you're no longer trying to prove anything as a sage. You're actually allowing for the hero to be the hero, and you get to be in the background with your hand on his back. That, I think, is such a difference and such a need in our society today. And the reality is every single one of us has the opportunity to become a sage. It's a matter of if we choose to or not.
Yeah. And what means so much to me now at this point in my life, I think it's more than just doing a podcast, but this whole idea of story, right? So, you brought up, you can learn anything on YouTube, which is kind of comical. And it really is true, but it's rather unfortunate to a large degree, right? Because it's not like when I grew up, right? We'd go over to grandma's house and sit there and play a board game on Sunday afternoon and listen to her tell story. Yes, Dad, if you're listening, Grandma Vivian. Yes. Okay. So, but those days are not, we just don't do as much of that anymore. We're right. Cause we're too busy. We're too busy. We're going 100 miles an hour, and we're not allowing those influencers in our life, I think, to allow us to live through and hear those stories.
It's so important. We as a people for millennia gathered around, whether it's living rooms or fire pits or, a long time ago, actual fires outside with our tents, right? Like there was a place where story is what held us together as community. And now we've lost, just as you said, we've lost a sense of not only like the general story or the meta narrative of God and who we are in the context of his story, but we've lost a sense of our story. And by doing so, I think we've lost a sense of what do we bring to the world, both whether we're 15, 50, or 100. Like we don't have a sense of our own story, and therefore, what are we going to share around the living room anymore?
Well, it's really true, Chris. I experience this all the time. People will say, well, what's the number one challenge guys have? And, I could give you a laundry list, but really it's that sense of purpose. As much as anything, you just lost that sense of purpose. And I tend to think that some of that comes from this idea of a relationship and not being in relationship and learning from our elder sages that can walk us through some of those challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you mentioned at the beginning that I am the founder and CEO of ReStory Counseling. And so a lot of the work that I do is walking with people into their stories. And the reality is that the sage doesn't know his or her own story, but so do the younger people. We don't know even that we have a story. I don't know how many times, Mike, I'll talk to somebody and they're like, yeah, I'm like, tell me a little bit of your story. And they'll be like, well, what do you mean? I don't have a story. What are you even talking
Yeah.
about? I don't have a story. And the reality is, no, you actually do, because someone bigger than you has a story for you to live. It's a story that was written
Yes.
far, far earlier, before your birth, before you even showed up on the planet. There was a story designed for you to partake in and participate in and live out. And that is some of the work, I think, of the sage, to recognize not only his current story as living that out as a sage, but what has it been, and what has it not been, and where has he been, and where has he not been, and what is still the things left to come. I feel like stepping into, in the book, the Sage book, I talk about different seasons of a man's life. And the reality is that most of those seasons, 5 out of those 6 seasons, happen before he becomes a sage.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the final stage, Mike, is what I would say is the pinnacle. That becoming a sage is the pinnacle, not becoming the warrior like we often talk about in men's work and men's ministry and all that, not being the king, not establishing your domain and having your business and having your family. That's part of it. But really the ultimate pinnacle of manhood, in my mind, is becoming that sage where you're actually able to step off the throne of your life and into some generative spaces where it's no longer about you, it's about the other people.
Yeah, listen, I love talking about the stages of a man's life. I've been trying to retrace this. I'm actually going to talk about this in my upcoming book a little bit. And in fact, I haven't seen too many people talk about this, but I kind of feel like I got stuck in the warrior stage and couldn't get out for the longest time. And we tend to when I get into these conversations, sometimes, we go through these stages and we try to wrap roughly, ages around them. And I never heard anybody say, oh, you could get stuck in a stage, but I kind of got stuck in a stage, I think, for a while with, like, how do you get out of here?
It's so true. It's so true. And I would say most of us have been conditioned to be stuck in either warrior or king. A
Yeah.
lot of us got stuck in the earlier kind of sexual awakening season of our lives, right? Where addictions happen and stuff like that, and they kind of grow in that sense. But really, most of us are conditioned that I'm going to play off of the name of your podcast here, that a true man is one who has the biggest muscles and the biggest kingdom. That is kind of the idea of where the fullness of masculinity, where we got socialized into believing that. I'm not sure that that's the case, but most of us get stuck there.
Yeah. And it's one of the reasons why I like to have the discussion, because, as men, we do such a crazy good job of isolating ourselves. And it's just too easy to gloss over the fact that, we do go through stages as a man. And oftentimes we do it in isolation because we don't have good people or a sage around us. Which is why this conversation is so valuable. In fact, share with us, how did this come to light for you? How did you go, I want to talk more about this whole area of sage? How did that happen for you?
Yeah. So I'll just basically say most of the work that I do is really trying to live out loud, in a sense of, like, I am in the process, I am in the journey, I am trying to figure this out myself. So the book and the process right now came out of, like, I am on the precipice of stepping into this. I don't see a lot of great roadmaps to help me know what does it look like for me to step in. I have some, ideas of people that are 20 years older than me that are giving me thoughts, but not someone who's right now in the midst of it, right now in that 40 to 60 range, age range, to kind of give me a sense of that. And so I was like, all right, I got to figure this something out. So there's that. But Mike, I'll tell you, it actually started when I was 16 years old. When I was 16, I was an exchange student in this will kind of give a little sense of how old I am, in what was West Germany. And so I was an exchange student in West Germany, and I only took with me a few English books because my goal was to, like, learn German and be fully immersed and acculturated. There were a few characters in these fiction books who were sages. And as I had the only, like, English escape of my life was to go read these 3 English books that I took with me, I latched my heart onto these sages, and I was like, I want to be like these guys. I want to be like these men. And then from there, from that point onward, it was, I want to grow into be like a sage, like they are in these books. So it's been a lifelong journey of desire and anticipation. And I just kind of had to let my chronology catch up with my desire of like, okay, now I'm finally stepping into the stage of my life where sage is a possibility, is a reality. So it was much more about me and all that. And, I have another book called Man Maker Project, and it is all about how a father leads his son into manhood, this intentional rites of passage for the 20th century kind of idea. And for me, it was, I recognized that rite of passage season for a boy, but I also recognized, like, for me as a sage, there is another rite of passage. There is another passage that happens. A boy becomes a man, and then a man becomes a sage, and there's some significant thresholds that we need to cross. And so I wanted to explore what that second passage is, that second threshold, that second piece of intentionality that we need in our lives to step into sage. That's where it came from for me.
Wow, that's quite a story. You went back a little earlier than I would have thought. A lot of people are not thinking along those lines that early on.
Of course, I had no language for it as a 16-year-old,
yeah, right,
18-year-old,
right.
19-year-old, 20, 30-year-old. I had no language for it then, but I just always had this kind of mindset of the kind of man that I wanted to become, especially as I aged into this older season. And all these characters, they were warriors, they were kings, they did all the kind of man journey stuff that we talk about. But when I intersected with them, and what I really latched onto was that idea of, I want to be that hero behind the hero.
Yeah, it's interesting, Chris, hearing you say that. I was just in my head reflecting how I was always attracted to, from a very young age, probably like you, to older adults.
Yeah.
And I think it was the story that they had to offer me, with hints of wisdom, right, along the way, that I gravitated towards. And they gravitated towards me because I would sit and listen, interestingly enough.
Yeah. And I bet those people that were not giving you advice.
Well, yeah, that was probably a poor choice of words on my
Well, you said story, but you said they were offering you story. They were not offering you advice.
Well, yeah. It was story, In fact, growing up, I remember mowing a guy's yard across the street, and I'd mow his yard, go in his house, collect his $5, and then sit there for an hour, which is longer than it took me to mow his yard, and listen to him talk about playing professional football, or whatever the story was of the day. But he loved it because he was by himself. He was isolated. And I was an opportunity. I was a captive audience, and I just enjoyed listening to his stories.
Yes. And from that, you absorbed something into your heart and into your life that wasn't just about his stories. It was, as you came to know his stories, you came to know yours. As you came to know, like, where he had been in his life, you came to have some imagination of what your life could look like, and where you might be able to go. And whether it was into professional sports like he had or not, it was a sense of, wow, there's something about life that we learn from sages who are just merely sharing their stories. But there's something different about, like, that guy could have been a creeper, right?
we didn't have those back then. No, we did.
Yeah. But what's the difference? What's the difference? What was it about you as a young boy that both felt safe and invited and curious and welcomed into his living room? Why would you as a boy want to sit and listen to this older man? There was something both about you, but also about him. There's something about him that had more than just stories, that I would venture to guess, Mike, that there was something that he had done in his own life. And this is what I talk about in Sage, is the things we need to do in order to move into the space where the younger generations, whether it's, children or younger adults, want to be with us, want to sit with us, want to engage with us. It's not about the information. It's about the presence that man brought you as a boy. It wasn't about the content of his stories necessarily. It might have been part of it to kind of win your imagination a little bit, but really there was something about his presence that helped you feel settled and welcome and interested in him. So that's what I talk about in Sage, is what is that passage that we need to pass in order to come to the place of really, like I said earlier, coming home to ourselves.
I hadn't thought about this in years, Chris. So it's funny we're having this conversation, but I got to tell you, you're explaining that. And I'm thinking to myself how full my heart feels listening to you explain as we're playing this back. And, I hope that's what the listeners grabbing hold of right now is that, when you have that presence of story or those people in your life that can speak into it, just how full you can fill. And I haven't told anybody this story or talked about it in years, Chris. And here we are on a podcast talking about it. And I'm like, wow, I just went back in time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's incredible how much of an impression these kinds of people can make on us. And whether it's in your active conscious memory, or if that man and some of the things that he offered you and others along your journey of life, it might not be conscious memory. It might be more that implicit, like just impression of invitation and welcome into manhood, into, kind of the design of your purpose and all those kinds of things. That I think is so important. And what I don't see in society is enough of those kinds of sages.
Yeah.
Right. We don't have enough of those sages. And here's the thing is that I'm all for retirement. I'm all for golf games. I'm all for, snowbirds who go south and whatever. So I don't want anybody to get the impression that I'm anti-retirement. However, I feel like what the generations, most recent generations have done is taken retirement as an excuse to depart society for their own pleasure.
Ooh, yeah.
And there is something there that, yes, you have worked hard and you do deserve to, kind of go have a really good golf game. I'm not against that. But when the departure from society then leaves society hamstrung without, the wisdom, the process, the information, the insight into what is life actually about, then we kind of lose our way. And I feel like that's where we are as a society, is we've lost our way because several recent generations have departed and have kind of felt like that's the point of life, is to get to 65 and disappear. And I'm like, no, actually now is the time that you're most needed in society. And all throughout, scripture and history, we see these elders who are, I talk about them in the sense of, they're the pylons of society. They're the ones that kind of hold. There's no more skin in the game for them. They're not trying to defend their kingdom or build their whatever. It's just that they have the wisdom and settledness of self to be able to go, hey, yes or no, or let me think about it this way, or let's move into some conversation with God or each other in a way that is different than maybe what a king or a warrior or someone else might wonder about. Pylons in society, we just don't have them.
Yeah, it's interesting. Now you brought up rite of passage. This is, you can't move along in the process without it. And so do you, and I look at what's going on in our culture right now, and it feels like this rite of passage is something that we gloss all over. Now in the Jewish community, it's very much alive and part of what they do. But for the rest of society, this seems like a non-existent conversation.
Yeah.
Is that kind of where this process gets stuck. I don't even know what the right word is.
Yeah, I mean, it's so sad, Mike, to see just the state of our boys and girls as they become adults. They have no one to guide them into what that means. And it's fascinating when you begin to think of the kind of ritualistic nature over millennia of what it means to go from boy into man or from girl into woman. And I think there's something in the rite of passage from girl into woman that has a lot more physicality to it because of the starting of her period and that kind of the becoming of the woman. But for boys, like we've just left that to, hey, when you get your driver's license or when you can vote or when you leave the house, like that, bless you, good for you, you're now a man. And I feel like to become a man is actually needing to be named a man in the company of other men. It's we talk about this a lot in the ministry that I lead, Restoration Project, of there needs to be a verbal passage process, a ceremonialized passage process for the boy to go, hey, I may not physically be fully a man yet. I don't have the responsibilities of a man yet and all of that, but I know that my community believes and speaks into the fact that I am a man. Everything that I need to be a man is inside of me. Because what is the question that I think most of us men have is like, am I man enough for this? Do I have what it takes? Do I have a sense of, right? I have a sense of the goodness of God inside of me in my manhood. And for most guys that don't have that rite of passage to look back to, the answer is no. No one ever said, I'm a man. No one ever deemed me a man. And I feel like what we need in rites of passage for boys becoming men is for that to occur. Jewish culture, other cultures around the world have that kind of ritualistic process. Some of them are pretty brutal. And I'm not suggesting that that's what we do, but in Sage, I talk about it this way, that that the first passage, the task of the first passage is for the father to find the man within the boy and call him forth. The task of the second passage is to find the boy within the man and bring him home.
Wow.
That, I think, is what the two separate passages are, is the fullness of integration. And we don't have the first and we don't have the second. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at here in Sage, is we need both.
Yeah. And so if you don't get both, and honestly, I never had, was a part of any ceremony really till I went away to a retreat weekend where, a group of men where, we were telling our stories, and then that affirmation that came after that. Wow. What a process. Very intense in a good way. I mean, there's nothing more beautiful than have a group of men affirming your story and praying over you. It's just one of the more powerful things I've ever had happen to me in my life, really.
Yes, absolutely. And here's the thing, is that most of us, I never got that growing up. Most of us never got that. And so what you're describing is that it's never too late for that affirmation of who you are, who you were designed to be, of yourself as a man. It's never too late for other men to do that with you. And so it's really important for us to be in communities of other men.
Yes.
In order for that to happen. But then also, as men now, as a dad, it is like, what would I like to offer the next generation? What will I do with my kids? And I talk a lot with guys who have adult kids who are 30, 40 years old. And the reality is, it's also never too late for there to be some blessing, some affirmation from the father to the son. In that sense, ideally, it's going to be when he's, in his teen years, when there's that movement from child into young adult. But that's okay. We can do it whenever. Even, we just see it all throughout the ages. And I think the responsibility of becoming a sage, the funny thing is that becoming a man ideally happens in the context of community.
Yeah.
In many ways, becoming a sage, that second passage, is something that you have to do alone. It is not something that passage is, no one else is going to be able to do that work for you. It is that self-reflection. It is that bringing, I talk about bringing the boy home. That's something that you need to do on the inside for you. And maybe you have a guide, maybe you have a counselor or, a coach or someone who's helping you through that process. That's all fine and good, but they're not going to be able to do that for you. That's something that is up to you to do.
I commonly talk about that, Chris. I think that we all have the answers inside of us. We just sometimes need a guide to ask really good questions and listen and bring it out. And that's where the whole idea of having a sage in your life or a really good coach or a really good counselor is critically important. And my experience has been, I'd love for you to talk into this a little bit, is sometimes this stuff doesn't pop into your life until you've lived a little bit. And by that time, you're in that middle age portion of life a lot of times. And, consider, my primary client to be a middle-aged man because they've lived a little. Maybe they've had a regret or two. Maybe things haven't gone their way, but they're moving into the fourth quarter and they're going, man, how do I want to live this thing out? What do I want my legacy to be? And I think it's really, really good to be asking those questions because, we can walk through it and figure those out. So talk about that. Yeah. What happens in those middle gears when we get to that point?
So to answer that question, I'm going to introduce two different concepts, that I talk about in the book. One of the concepts is called projections, and one of the concepts is called personas. Okay. So projections are, as we are growing up, those kinds of internal questions that we have inside of us that we are projecting out into the world, just like a movie projector kind of puts it out into the world onto other people and screens in order for us to go like, is this true? Am I a man? Where will I go? What is my purpose? Like all those projections are put out there. What is my value? And so we project onto our parents when we're kids, we project onto our coaches, we project onto our siblings, we project onto our teachers, our grades. Eventually, as we graduate and, get a job, we project onto our bank account, we project onto our career, our title, like all those things. What value do I have in the world? We project that question out and we're looking for someone else to answer that question for us.
I felt like you were just talking to me. Yes, indeed.
Okay, well, let's just remember that I went through this whole process because I needed a guide for myself. And so I'm still trying to figure this out. So that's one of the things. The other is, and I'll just put it in these terms, a projection is like the mask that I put on someone else in order to tell me who I am. A persona actually is drawn from the theater world, that I put on my own self a persona. I take on a character. I begin to act in a certain way because other people are telling me, hey, when you are the class clown, you're accepted. When you are the science geek, you have friends. When you are, the star quarterback on the team, that's when you're going to get the accolades. So there's a sense of the persona is the one that other people put on you. In family of origin work, this gets in a little to my counselor. And in family of origin work, it's, hey, when you behave, then you get more love from mom. Or right, when you empty the dishwasher, there's going to be, the night will go better. When you take care of XYZ, your father, who typically comes home in a certain way, angry, when you engage with him in a certain way, then his anger starts to go down. All right. So there's some level of really young personas that we have that other people are kind of telling us, when we act these ways, we will be more accepted. So we have these projections and we have these personas. And the reality is, Mike, that they work.
Very well.
They work.
Right.
They work until, and to your point,
yes,
until we come to the end of our projections and personas, until we have worn them out. and we realize, and usually it's sometime, like you were saying, it usually is sometime in those middle years.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say middle years. It can go, all the way down into the 20s and 30s, even because of some events, circumstances that might come up in our lives. It doesn't have to mean like 40s and 50s, but typically it's going to be in that, 30s, 40s, 50s range, where we've worn out our projections and we've worn out our personas. When there's some kind of crisis where the bank account gets drained, where we lose our job, where there's a relational stress with our spouse, where something happens with one of our kids, and all of those things that we've hoped would give us a sense of purpose and identity, they start to fail us.
Yeah.
That is what, in my mind, is the definition of the crisis that happens at midlife, is that the things that we have relied on to determine who we are no longer helping us the way that they did before. And so therefore, we're kind of left with this, like, now what? Now what do I do?
Yeah. Is this it?
Yeah. And so many guys go back and they like just redouble their efforts. Okay, if that marriage didn't work, well, then I'm going to project onto another woman in order for this new marriage. Or if this career didn't work, then I'm going to get, and if this car didn't work, then I'm, whatever it is, we redouble our efforts. A couple months ago, I took a group of people, a group of men to Ireland. And we went through this sage experience and journey that I led them on. And we came to the far western coast, the cliffs of Moher. And my metaphor for that was, we've kind of journeyed across the country and we've come to the end of ourselves. We've come to the end of the land. And now we need another vehicle to go any further. Now, the car that we took across the land can't get us across the water. And those cliffs are like sheer cliffs. And that's what it feels like in midlife. I've come to the end of myself, what I have known, and therefore I don't know how to go any further. And so many people, like I said, just loop back and they just get another car, they get another wife, they get another job, but they don't go further. And that's why it's a second passage. It's a second passage into the sage to actually go, there might be more for me than I have previously known. So I come to that answer in a long-winded way. Sorry about that, but that's what I see in the midlife crisis, right? Like we do go through a crisis because what we have known no longer works.
Yeah, I'm going to be in Ireland this summer. I'm going to have to look up the itinerary and see if I'm going to be anywhere near that cliffs. By the way, I am afraid of heights. I won't go within 25 yards of it, but it sounds really cool. Yeah, what you're explaining, listen, very valid, not long-winded, very detailed answer, and a very important one, because men need to understand. I think what you just gave, you just kind of laid out, what really goes on in a man's life. And if they, if they haven't heard it said out loud, I think it was good for you to lay it out in that way, because this is what happens to a lot of guys. Well, I got married and ended in divorce. Well, if you look at divorce rates in this country, and I know you're aware of this, second divorces fail faster, third divorces fail faster. And part of the reason is we just take that baggage along with us without ever looking in the mirror to do the hard work. And it's not the other person's fault, typically. It's you. Surprise, surprise. And this tends to, in my experience, show up in that middle portion of life, when you're like, just shaking your head going, man, I feel like I'm better than this, but I'm not sure what to do. So Chris, what can we help them do? What can we help them do?
Help these men?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is just even talking about this, that there is something more.
Yeah.
Like just saying, hey, that you've come to this precipice in your life, and there is actually a second passage. There is actually something else for you, that what you have known is not the fullness of what there is to know. And so I think just even giving a vision for becoming a sage, every Jedi wants to be a Jedi master, not just stop at being a Jedi. And I feel like where we stop is like, okay, I've become a man, and now that's it. Now I'm a man. And we just kind of think that a man lasts until you pass away. And I feel like, no, there's actually something next after becoming a man, is becoming a sage. So the first thing is that there is a vision for that. The second is to help men realize that the work is not outside of them.
Yeah.
That the work is on the inside of them, which is why I talk about, the second passage. The task of the second passage is to find the boy within the man and bring him home, to do some of that reflection work, to do some of that internal work of where are the places where you did project, where you did take on personas. What was your family of origin like? What are the stories? Where did you begin to shatter the parts of you into various places where there is shame, where there is guilt, where there is contempt, where there is loss, where there are addictions, where there are things, not just secrets. I'm not talking about the things you never told people, where you're supposed to, confess your sins and have accountability. That may or may not be part of it, but I'm talking more of where are the parts of you that you left in the past that didn't get space, that didn't get, attention because you were so engaged in projections and personas kind of stuff, that we need to go back for in order to reintegrate you. So it's all on the inside. It's not on the outside. And so much of our man life is spent on the outside. Who am I becoming? What am I doing? What am I building? And we've got to do the work on the inside for the sage. So that would be the first thing that I would say, is we've got to help men think through and reflect on who they are internally and where they've left parts of themselves in the past that we need to go back for.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's so important. It's not the cars, it's not the house, it's not the pile of money that matters in the end. There's so much more available. And I talk about this quite often because you don't want to be chasing when what you really need is right there in front of you.
Yes. You mentioned the word legacy earlier, and I firmly believe that the greatest legacy that we can leave for the generations after us is not our wealth, but the wealth of our presence.
Oh yeah.
That is a game changer. That is a family tree changer. That is the greatest legacy that we can leave, is that and it passes on and passes on, that there was a strong and present and kind man in the family. That changes generations to come far more than any kind of financial benefit that we could leave.
Yeah, and it's so needed right now. So needed right now in a world that just seems
absolutely
just angry and hurt. Yeah. Sad.
Yeah, and I don't know if you know some of the statistics, but when men show up, and I don't mean this because women don't show up. I feel like women show up because men aren't showing up. And I bless our sisters. I bless the women in the world to say thank you. And oh my gosh, what you have had to carry because men have not shown up. But when men show up in these ways, the whole system changes. The whole system changes. And so if we want to see systemic change across the country and across the world, we've got to sink into some of these realities that we're talking about today.
I couldn't agree more. And it is important that we show up. I mean, that's how you become a true man, and that's how we create true men. Chris, thank you so much for being on the pod. I just absolutely enjoyed this conversation. I think I'm going to have to fly out to Colorado so I could sit on that beautiful leather sofa and have a whiskey with you. But tell everybody, Chris, and we'll certainly put this in the show notes, but how can they get a hold of you? How can they grab hold of the book and learn more about you?
Yeah, for sure. So if anybody is interested in getting a first chapter of any one of my books, they're all kind of available. So go to restorationproject.net/first chapter, and you can just download the first if you're curious about the Manmaker Project book, the Sage book. I have another book about brotherhood. So you can kind of get those. ReStory.life is where the counseling center is. And we are located in Colorado, but we have a team across the country that can work with people in all kinds of places. And I do intensives and stuff like that too. So there's that. And then the book is on Amazon. Just search for Sage Chris Bruno, and you should be able to find it there pretty easily on Amazon.
Well, there you go. If I were you, I'd go grab that book. I know it's going to be the first thing I do when I get done here, because I want to learn more about becoming a sage, because I'm headed in that direction. There's no stopping it. And I'm going to enjoy every minute of it. So thank you for being on the podcast, Chris.
Absolutely, Mike. So great to be with you today. Thank you.
All right. Take care.